Fernando Alonso celebrating his 100th podium was our highlight of the weekend in Saudi Arabia. Aston Martin and Fernando have been the story of the season so far, and it's been great to see their design team being rewarded for a winter of hard work. Thanks to the FIA's penalty system, it was almost taken away from him before competitive integrity prevailed, and he was given it back. This time, the FIA are acting to fix their archaic regulations quickly though. Want to know what's changing? Then stick around for the rest of the video. Before the season began, Fernando Alonso had only picked up a single top 3 finish in his last 6 seasons in the sport, but 2 in 2 races this year has brought the veteran racer to the monumental 100 podium milestone. It made him the 6th racer to reach the milestone, and it's looking like he'll pass Raikkonen and Prost's tally this season to become the driver with the 4th most podiums in the history of the sport. It's nice to see that hard work pays off, but it almost didn't in Saudi Arabia. And it is a shame that the memory of his 100th podium will be tarnished by the absolute farce that surrounded it. Let's start off by giving you the details of what happened, and taking a bit of a deep dive into the rules that govern the events that happened during the race. The incident that triggered this series of remarkable events happened in the moments just before the race started. As Alonso arrived in his 2nd place grid slot, he did so with the contact patches of his Aston Martin's left tyres crossing over the line marking the left-hand side limit of his grid spot. Up until recently, the only rule governing a driver's position in the grid slot was how far forward the car was, but in this year's sporting regulations, the positioning of the front wheels within the side markings of the slot was also added. A yellow line is painted to the right-hand side of the white grid markings to give drivers a visual reference of how far forward they are in their slot. But lining up between the lines relies entirely on the driver's approach to their position. Lining up outside the box is an easily identifiable transgression thanks to cameras and technology on the grid, and results in a slam dunk 5-second penalty. Esteban Ocon received the same penalty at the opening race 2 weeks earlier. Why the FIA feels the need to punish drivers for being slightly to the left or right of their pit box, I don't know. The 5-second penalty seems so harsh for us, and George Russell agrees. I think a little bit of common sense needs to be shown. I think he was a bit to the left, he gained nothing from this. Perhaps a 5-second penalty is too much. Maybe a track limits warning would be more appropriate, but this isn't what we're here to discuss today. Formula 1 sporting regulations dictate that 5-second time penalties must be served at the driver's next pit stop, with the clock starting once the car has become stationary, and mechanics waiting 5 seconds before starting work on the car. If the driver does not make another pit stop after being awarded the penalty, the 5 seconds are simply added to their race time at the end. Alonso served his penalty at his pit stop on lap 18, during a safety car period triggered by the retirement of his teammate Lance Stroll. The Aston Martin mechanics observed the 5 seconds before getting stuck into the tyre change. But whether they'd started work on the car before that time became the key factor in the post-race controversy. We've seen some discussion about drivers not being allowed to take pit stop penalties during safety car periods, but that only applies to drive-through and stop-go penalties, which this was not. Every penalty served in the pit lane is observed by the FIA in real time and reviewed by race control, as well as the FIA's Remote Operations Centre, or ROC, in Geneva, where the FIA is based. This is one of the new measures implemented by racing's governing body, after a mistake by race director Michael Massey influenced the outcome of the 2021 World Championship. The ROC has been compared to the video assistant referee system in football, but it is also similar to how the NFL assesses officiating decisions in real time from New York. Any sign of a transgression and the incident and evidence is referred to the independent stewards for consideration. This takes some of the workload off those in race control on race day, letting them focus on more pressing issues. On the initial review of Alonso's pit stop, everything was considered okay. Certainly watching from home, it appeared that no one did anything that could be called work. It was just a bunch of guys playing statues for 5 seconds. The first hint that that might not be the case came in the final laps from the radio chatter of a rival team, with Mercedes informing George Russell that Alonso, the car ahead, might have an additional time penalty to serve at the end of the race, and to make sure he reduced the gap as much as possible. We actually talked about how Mercedes caused this penalty in the first place in our most recent video, if you want to check that one out after this one. When George Russell's race engineer told him to push in case of a penalty, there was still no official suggestion from the FIA of a penalty. The penalty had been served on lap 18. Why would anyone think that it would take the FIA the rest of the race to work out if he'd served it correctly or not? It wasn't until he was on the podium that F1's official messaging system said the FIA had noted an incident, which quickly resulted in a full investigation into Alonso's pit stop, Shortly after, Alonso had left the podium and entered the TV pen to complete more media duties. News was out that he'd been served a 10-second time penalty, which would be added to his race time and meant he would lose third position to Russell. However, the official document detailing the reasoning for the penalty would not be made public until after midnight, over 3 hours later, adding to the confusion over exactly what happened. Today is not a good day for the fans when you have 35 laps to apply a penalty and to inform about the penalty, and you wait for after the podium, he said. There is something really wrong in the system, but it's the way it is. Fernando has it spot on. There really is something terribly wrong with the system. Imagine if the football or NFL system allowed penalties to be issued after a game finished and without explanation. Imagine it's the Super Bowl and a touchdown gets ruled out after the game has finished, changing the result. You'd have Storming of the Capitol Part 2, Return of the Mob. It was only on the final lap that race control had shared a new report with the stewards stating that ROC now did not think the penalty had been properly observed and requested a full stewards investigation. The decision, which eventually followed shortly after midnight in Saudi Arabia, would state, based on the representation made to the stewards that there was an agreed position that touching the car would amount to working on the car, the stewards decided to impose a penalty. The timing of this is painfully well played by Mercedes, but again, check out our last video for that. This agreed position would prove key. After the opening race of the year, the FIA's Sporting Advisory Committee, or SAC, which includes the 10 teams, had met and, among other things, discussed what did and what did not constitute working on the car. According to FIA Race Director Niels Wittich and new FIA Sporting Director Steve Nielsen, who presented the alleged Aston Martin transgression to the stewards in Saudi Arabia on the final lap. The SAC had agreed that touching the car in any way during the time penalty period was tantamount to working on it. It was on this basis that the stewards awarded the 10-second post-race penalty, as it emerged via video footage that the rear jack, one of the two devices used to hoist the car into the air as the tyres are changed, was touching the rear of Alonso's car during the 5 seconds. It was hoped this had cleared the matter up, but based on its own interpretation of what was actually written in the rules, and backed up by previous examples of time penalties being served at pit stops, Aston Martin did not believe that a jack touching the car constituted work taking place. Alonso's team appealed the decision, and 40 minutes later, an Aston Martin team representative, sporting director Andy Stevenson, went to the stewards for a hearing. Aston Martin was granted its right to review after sending both the minutes of the SAC meeting and video evidence of 7 different instances where a jack had touched a car during a penalty similar to the one Alonso served during the race, which were not penalised. This met the FIA's threshold of significant and new information coming to light and allowed for the review, which proved successful. Alonso was rightly given his place back because having a 10-second penalty for a jack touching a car is a complete farce, especially when it is issued almost an hour after the perceived offence occurred. Now, the governing body has called a meeting of the SAC ahead of the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne in order to clarify the meaning behind Article 54.4 of its sporting regulations. It currently reads, whilst the car is stationary in the pit lane as a result of incurring a penalty, it may not be worked on until the car had been stationary for the duration of the penalty. The definition of worked on is expected to be clarified so that teams are prevented from touching the car at all while a penalty is served. Esteban Ocon was punished for the exact same series of events in the first race of the season, and that was an absolute farce then as well. Clearly, the punishments are not proportional to the offence in many of these cases, and that needs to be looked at in detail. The Formula 1 sporting regulations have been amended a ridiculous number of times at this point, and many rules are now contradictory or just make no sense, such as a 10-second penalty for having a rear jack touch a car during a penalty being served. Perhaps it is time for the FIA to revisit the entire book and review it with the teams to bring some sensibility back to the sport. Do you think the penalties that Esteban and Alonso served are proportional to what they did? Let us know your thoughts on it all in the comments down below. And until next time, drive safe and bye for now.